Welcome, Mirabai. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Sarah. I love being here.
And I like to start by asking our guests how you started your day today.
Well, I travel a lot, but I'm home right now. And when I'm home, I rest in routine. I love it. It's like a refuge for me to kind of do the same thing every day and every evening if possible. And so I wake up and I do yoga pretty much every day of my life since I was around 13, 14. And I don't do a long session, but I do about 6 sun salutations. And that just, it greets the day. It's a ritual, it's a prayer, it's an offering, and it's really good for my whole body. And then I sit in meditation for about 20 minutes. And then after, and this is what I did this morning, and then afterwards, I do a little bit of Lectio Divina, sacred reading, but I don't do it in the standard kind of Christian monastic style where you read scripture and you do it in a certain formula, right? But I read poetry. Sometimes I'll read sacred texts like the Bhagavad Gita from Hinduism or the Tao Te Ching from Taoism, but mostly I read contemporary poetry, mostly from the margins, so that I'm getting to hear voices that I might not otherwise encounter. So that's part of my practice too, is searching for those voices and getting recommendations. So that's how I started my day. And then I go downstairs and I have this like cuddle fest with my 2 dogs, Lola and Ruby, every morning. I mean, it's intentional. I used to do it with my children when they were little. An intentional few minutes to just snuggle and coo and like that connect. And then my husband comes last. Then
Yeah.
coffee with my beloved.
What poetry are you feeling drawn to right now?
Well, I've been looking for women of color. Yeah, mostly women of color. And so I people give me different recommendations. I have some great anthologies. Sorry, anytime anyone asks me that question, it puts me on the spot. To tell you the
Yeah.
absolute truth, the last week, what I've been reading is all the poetry from the last 3 issues of The Sun magazine. Do you know The Sun?
Mm, I
It's
don't know it.
Oh, it has been my favorite magazine for at least 30 years, maybe close to 40 years. It's a literary magazine also dedicated to social action, environmental justice. They also have an incredible selection of photographs, and they have mostly personal essays I've written for The Sun. And their essays are very quirky and very edgy, and their poetry is too. So,
Mm,
because I was gone for a couple of months, I had a nice stack of January, February, and March. And so I've been reading
okay.
the poems in the sun. They're always good. They're always, always
Great.
good.
Good to
I
know.
would say Alison Luterman was the last poet I read, and she is not a woman of color, but she might as well she's probably considered to be a marginalized poet in the sense that she's not singing any kind of mainstream song. She's very much a critic of the status quo and does it in the most delightful embodied language that kind of it's like a bell that wakes you up. So Alice
Mm.
Oseman, I would say, is my latest favorite.
And we're here today to talk about your latest book, Ordinary Mysticism, which it feels like this is like a hologram of also other books that you've written. Like it's in this definitely in the same family. How would you define mysticism and a mystic? Who is a mystic?
You are, and all of you listening are. And that's not glib. That's super important for me to establish. Okay, so back to definition. A mystic is someone who has a direct experience of the sacred. It doesn't have to be in the idea package of God in God language, but some sense of connectedness to something that is holy, that is sacred, that is imbued with a kind of beauty and meaning and depth and something bigger than our ordinary, no, not than our ordinary experience, because that would just cancel out my thesis that everything is sacred. But that sense of connectedness to something larger and beautiful and alive, deeply alive. So a mystical experience is an experience of that, a direct experience. It has nothing to do with a belief system or a ritual that you may have done or some ordained clergy person who told you that this is the way to connect with the holy. It can happen. It can happen while hiking, which is what just happened for me a few minutes ago, right before we started this podcast. I walk almost every day. I have the great fortune of living on the border of national forest here in New Mexico. And I get out in the woods with my dogs all the time. So it's a constant opportunity for a mystical experience. It's not guaranteed. As my mom taught me what makes it mystical, and she taught me this recently at age 89, what makes an experience mystical isn't just, oh, what a beautiful sunset, or what a tender kiss, or hearing about someone's suffering opens my heart. All of those things are invitations to a mystical experience. But you, as the mystic, get to kind of open the door. The door, something knocks on the door, some beauty, some touch, some beckoning of the sacred, this sense that you have, and you open that door and you step through into that sacred landscape. There is an intentionality along with this availability. And so, yes, hiking or kissing or cooking or making love can all be mystical experiences if we step into that sacred terrain with intention. But also, religious spaces can be, religion can be an obstacle to a mystical experience. And I think a lot of you are probably resonating with that statement. The stuffy churches of your childhood or something, with their narrow political views, maybe, or the us and them language, the insiders and the outcasts. So religion can be an obstacle to a mystical experience, that is, to a direct felt experience of the sacred, but it doesn't have to be. Like you can be singing hymns in the cathedral and have that experience of your heart opening and lifting and connectedness to something that is beyond you. For me, I am kind of a spiritual harlot. I sleep with all the gods, and I have a deep connection to many different spiritual traditions. So I experience it chanting kirtan in Hinduism and sitting in zazen in Buddhism and praying on my tasbih, my prayer beads in Sufism. There are many spaces that evoke that for me that are age-old, perennial wisdom spaces. So they don't have to be an obstacle or an impediment, right, to mystical experience. There are treasures at the heart of all the world's wisdom ways, and I don't want to discount them, even as I'm kind of trying to help people disentangle their spirituality from religiosity.
I read this book, and I read most of my books in bed at night before I go to sleep. And when I would wake up in the morning after reading it, it'd be kind of like fresh in my consciousness, and it would just bring an extra level of presence to what I was doing. And just one of the first things I do in the morning is like I go downstairs and I drink some water. I make some celery juice for myself and my partner. And I just remember those mornings when I was reading this, like being extra present and really just feeling into each thing that I was doing and remembering like this is, like the subtitle of your book, your life is sacred ground. Like my life is sacred ground. And it felt really important to do it at that time. I think I was reading this around the time of the elections here in the US, and the anxiety was high and there's a lot of chaos. And that's just only continued into this year. And I know a lot of women listening are feeling more infringed upon by the events in the world. And I'm wondering what you have to say around being a mystic amidst all that's happening right now. And that you're saying like this isn't a path where we need to withdraw from the world. It's about engaging in the world. And how can we do that more intentionally amidst all the challenges that are here in our daily lives right now?
Mm. Such a good, vibrant, important question. Very live for many of us. I've been asked that question around 11,000 times in the last year. And let's see if I give you the fresh version of conversation between Mirabai and Sarah, what's arising right now.
Yeah.
It's not about, as you really referenced just now, rising above the world. Being a mystic is not rising above your circumstances. And so we're not using spiritual practices and prayers and sacred scriptures and um, contemplative practices, meditation, as a way to armor ourselves or insulate ourselves or anesthetize ourselves from the painful realities of the world. And for those of us who, like you and me, Sarah, are highly sensitive people, we do need to titrate a bit our engagement with the realities that are coming, as Matthew Fox said to me in a conversation last night, these things that are coming like machine gun fire at us right now. And that's what it feels like you're going to die, and people who you love are going to die. It feels like such an assault. And so, with kindness and compassion for ourselves, we soften and open our hearts. I have my friend Stephen Levine, the late great Stephen Levine, someone who really introduced the path of death and dying as a conscious opportunity to awaken, even in the death process and the dying process. Stephen called it keeping your heart open in hell. Keeping your heart, how do we keep our hearts open in hell? And my teacher, Ram Dass, used to quote Stephen all the time saying, yeah, this is the curriculum, he called it, keeping our hearts open in hell. And so it's a matter of cultivating those mystical moments. For me, contemplative practice, it happens to be a silent sitting practice in the mornings, but it can be a movement, a conscious movement practice. I also do that with the yoga, but some kind of practice that invites you to slow down, connect with your breath, with your body, ground into the earth, extend your senses to connect with the environment around you, and intentionally creating spaces of stillness helps tremendously for me and for a lot of people I know in being able to meet the chaos of the world with some degree of equanimity and steadiness. And one of the reasons that feels important to me is not just so that I can feel better and I can manage my nervous system effectively. That's a benefit of contemplative practice, but really it's other focused. I want to be, if I can, in any way that I'm able, a source of steadiness and comfort and sanity to other people who are freaking out right now. And I can do that when I tend my own inner sanctum.
So do you find that, and I'll just share a personal example, like I found at the beginning, like the first 2 months of this year have been very challenging. Just a lot of stuff in my personal life and then everything collectively. And I reached a place where I just realized I need to put some stronger boundaries in place here
Mm.
and really kind of reassessing my day-to-day life, my weekly flow. And right now I have it situated that I'm not online from Friday through Monday. And so it's just Tuesday to Thursday that I'm engaging in the world. That's helping a lot. And even on those Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's like I'm really safeguarding my practice time in the morning, even elongating my practices more. And so I'm wondering if and I'm still, feeling into how this is, what's going to be sustainable. But I'm curious if there's more things that you've put into place or just reinforced with what's happening, or just during times of life that feel more challenging.
Right, exactly. That's so good. Well, for those of you who've read my books, either Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics, or Ordinary Mysticism, Your Life as Sacred Ground, you know that in both books I really emphasize the importance of Sabbath. So I use the kind of traditional Jewish Shabbat container of lighting candles on Friday at sunset and observing a Sabbath until Saturday at sunset. Aside from that, I don't do it in a particularly Jewish or religious way. I was born into a non-religious but Jewish family, so Judaism is my ancestral heritage, and I find treasures there that sustain me in my life. But I'm by no means a religious Jew. But that container of Shabbat is so beautiful for me and for my non-Jewish husband and for our children and grandchildren. So I do say the prayers in Hebrew that I learned in the song because it's beautiful to welcome the Sabbath. In Judaism, you welcome the Sabbath like a lover. You dress up, you clean the house, you make yourself as beautiful as whatever beauty means. And beauty isn't always pretty, to be ready to meet the beloved. And then I also don't use any, I don't do any electronic communications. I don't look at email. Email is my biggest tyrant, I think. And maybe many of you
Yeah,
listening,
same here.
yeah, it's like it used to be so much fun and such a great way to connect, and now it just tyrannizes us and bosses us around. I call it the Pharaoh who won't let my people go, but I insist, So on Shabbat, I disconnect, and I disconnect from everything that tyrannizes me, from the ongoing to-do list that in Wild Mercy, I talk about it as written in fluorescent ink that turns tasks into emergencies. And I give myself that breath, and the sky does not fall. I might have a little bit of catch up to do on Sunday, but that's part of Sunday, is that I sort of mindfully, with a nice cup of tea at my side, extending my Sabbath a bit, check email. And I try not to really do the things that I think I have to do. If I have to do it, even just now, like before we came on, I carried that Sabbath energy into my afternoon. Finished lunch, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be speaking with Sarah in a couple of hours. I could do these 11 things. Or I could go take a walk, and those 11 things will not torture me. They will not make my life come undone. There will be no grave consequences, actually. Believe it, Mirabai. Trust it, Mirabai. And off I went. And as a result, I feel so much more spaciousness to have this conversation with you and with all of you. And I know that afterwards I can take an hour before going to make dinner, because that's one of my favorite mystical practices, is making food for people I love. And in that hour, I bet you I'll get twice as much done as if I had gone at it from that place of desperation and obligation.
I love that you brought up your observance of Shabbat or the Sabbath, and that when I was reading that, I I felt, and I've felt this at other times, I feel envious of those who practice Judaism, because I just love that ritual so much. And I grew up Catholic, and for many years I've been observing like the Sabbath on Sunday. And it's just a day where I don't schedule anything. I try to be offline all day. Sometimes I don't do so well with that, but especially after reading your book and everything going on in the world, I'm like, okay, I'm really gonna use this day to unplug. But I just wish that it was more of like a world culture where we just had one day where we just stopped and we just rested. And it just seems like so much would be solved by that. And so I really appreciate that you are living that ritual with such devotion.
And I've shared it with literally thousands of people, mostly non-Jews. And I have said, please take this. This
Yeah.
belongs to you, and weave it into your life. And even if it's not a day a week from sunset to sunset, that particular version, there are other ways, little ways like what I just described with my walk. But there are rituals you can create for yourself that are not prisons to lock yourself into or to beat yourself up if you fail to uphold the boundary you set for yourself, but rather invitations into sacred space. And then this magical thing happens. I mean, it feels like magic to me, where it's almost like the universe morphs around my rest, my resting, my giving myself a break, my taking a breath. And everything that needs to be done gets done, but I do it in a much more centered way. So I think I just offer that to all of you, that you can build a version of this that fits the shape of your life. Try to be true to it, but true to it not as another thing on the to-do list. Now I rest or else, but rather as a loving invitation to yourself that you deserve.
I want to talk a bit about money and mysticism because it's also another thing to be on the spiritual path, to be of service while also making a sustainable living. And I know that in this book you share some stories about your own path of working with money and self-worth and making a sustainable living as a mystic, as a writer. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how you see that intersection between mysticism and service and money and livelihood and kind of how that's all unfolded and is unfolding in your life right now.
Yeah, well, I want to name that, I lived in a certain degree of privilege. I mean, I'm economically middle class, nothing special in terms of my wealth, but I am a white woman in America. And I have access to choices about my livelihood and about how I spend my time and about where I donate any excess. And how you define excess, of course, is purely subjective. Well, actually, in Islam and Judaism, I think it is an actual percentage of your income. And so I have choices that some people don't have. And when I was a young single mother, I had fewer choices also. And so for some people who are listening, you may be going, well, easy for her to say. She's got all these books and she has, a partner who helps support her and she owns her own home. And, I'm on the edge. I'm living paycheck to paycheck and it's a struggle and I don't have that luxury of even a Shabbat. But when I started my Shabbat practice, I was the busiest and poorest I've ever been in my life. And it was remarkably fruitful for me to weave that in to the overwhelm. It really, really helped. But as far as money goes, I also came of age in a kind of counterculture spiritual movement, sort of quasi Hindu Buddhist, let's call it, chanting with Krishna Das and yoga and mindfulness meditation. And many teachers and teachings came through our little town here of Taos, New Mexico. So I was exposed to lots of different wisdom traditions. And all of them, at least at that time, the 70s and 80s, were kind of preaching a gospel of, money is the root of all evil. That somehow the Dharma, you should not charge for the Dharma, that is the body of spiritual teachings, or healing in the indigenous traditions. Healers should never charge for for the healing they offered. And so by the time I was in my 40s and writing, and those of you who are authors know you don't make much money from writing books unless they're bestsellers, which is, 0.1% of books. And so you can't make a sustainable living, even writing book after book, really. I mean, it helps, it's something, but waitressing would be better, probably. And so I was in my 40s and I was teaching. I was an adjunct professor of philosophy and religious studies at the University of New Mexico here in Taos. And those of you who have taught adjunct know that you make about 35 cents an hour if you add it all up, all the work. It's that's not a sustainable living. And my husband was a carpenter working with his hands. He was in his 60s and his body was starting to have issues. And I was like, what now? What do I do? I love the mystics. I love these teachings. I love writing. I love literature. I pour myself into these workshops that I create and I come away with, $500 in my pocket. This isn't working. And I sat with a friend who is an entrepreneur, and she said, let's get to the bottom of what's going on here, Mirabai, because you're complaining a lot about this. I hear you. But I am feeling like it's some other narrative that you're telling yourself about money, that money is bad, that money is not spiritual. And I think, Mirabai, that it might be what's getting in your way. And so we kind of unpacked it together. She had a whole sort of system that she created to help me do this and help other women do this. And at the end of it, I am serious. At the end of it, something lifted and she said, what is your goal for next year, a year from now? So I think I was making like seriously about $28,000 that year. And I said, very kind of embarrassed, how about twice that much? And she said, okay, write that down, write that figure down. And, we did a little ritual, and within a year, I was making twice that much. And then the following year, a little more and a little more and a little more. And with each expansion, I have to take a breath, I'll admit, because the conditioning is pretty fierce. But I now know that I feel so much better and more energized and honored when I receive generous compensation for what I have poured myself into all of these years, these decades. And has that changed my generosity of spirit? Not one iota. If anything, I feel more dedicated to being of service, but I'm no longer a martyr. Does that help?
It does help. Yeah. And I think that this is like, these are questions and work that all of us do as women and also spiritually inclined women. And one of the insights that I had at a certain point was like, there's a universal law of fair exchange. And for me, I noticed a tendency to always be like leaning in, over giving. And that in itself is throwing off that balance of fair exchange. So
Right.
it's been like a listening, like, what is the fair exchange here? And sometimes it's uncomfortable because it's like working against that impulse to override it, to overgive it. Yeah. Thank you for
It's
sharing
really,
that.
it's very strong, a strong message in women especially, yes.
And seems for you that writing is a very mystical experience.
Yes.
It is for me as well. And so teaching is for me as well. And maybe the same is true for you. It's kind of
Hmm.
similar stream coming out in different ways. And I'm wondering how it is like with other aspects of particularly business and livelihood. How do you integrate the mysticism into those things? Like, talking about like, the tyranny of email or, these things that feel more monotonous that are required to kind of keep the wheels moving in one's life and in one's work. How do you connect the mysticism in those moments or in those places?
Mm. Well, full disclosure, I find people to help me. I can't do it all myself. And I believe strongly in collaboration and teams. And so I've set my life up in such a way that I make enough money to pay a team of incredible young women who handle a lot of the things that were distracting me from my creative work and from my teaching, from my being some kind of conduit for these teachings to come through, whether the writing or the actual teaching. And so that's kind and when I called that in, it worked. It worked. And those women actually helped me to make enough money to pay them. And they're really good at all those things, marketing and budgets and spreadsheets and schedules. And also my partner enjoys numbers. And so I hate them and I can't hold them in my head. I can't make sense of them. I really try. But he loves that stuff. So that that helps. And again, this is a privilege, and I recognize that not everybody has access to the support that I do, but it took me a long time to get there. Really, since it's only been in the last few years since I was just about 60. I'll be 64 next month. And yeah, it took a long time to be able to recognize that we all have different gifts. And if we can come together, there are people who can joyfully fill in your gaps, and then that can liberate you to do what you're really here to do.
Do you remember if there was a particular moment where you just said, I'm not going to do it this way anymore? I'm going to hand these things off. That's not my that's not my true calling to other people. Or was it more of a gradual process over years?
It was more gradual, but if I really look back on it, it went, it grew in tandem with this liberating sense that that it's okay for me to make a, a good living, and that I could be, because I knew that if I could make more money than I was making, substantially more, I would be able to share those resources with others. And that is exactly what's happened. It's not like I pocket it all. I'm not an oligarch. I'm not buying a new yacht. I am finding ways to it's almost like cooking a feast and inviting everyone I love to eat. So yeah, it was gradual, but there was definitely a turning point that had to do with acknowledging that yes, you can charge money for the Dharma, and that doesn't make you unspiritual.
Do you feel like then the work that you feel really called to do, that has shifted or amplified since you made that shift for yourself?
Hmm. I'm still leading retreats and teaching workshops, which I love with all my heart. I'm doing it more selectively now in giving talks. What I am very discerning when I receive an invitation. So I'm able to be more discriminating about what I say yes to. I also started my own business, Wild Heart, and Wild Heart was created as a way for me to teach and share the my books in my own space, and have, instead of being fragmented and going to I won't name them, but all the different retreat centers around the country, in fact, around the world, and online platforms. And I just felt so dissipated. And by creating Wild Heart with my business partner, Willow, who was my former assistant, my first real assistant, I was able to localize my teachings in one space, and really focus more exclusively on what is most alive for me, which is, alive is a funny word because death and dying is a deep and profound interest of mine, more in the realm of grief. And grieving the death of loved ones is a special space for me, a very sacred space for me. So grief as a spiritual path, I'm able to really cultivate that space through Wild Heart. It's a community that we call Holy Lament. And then also women's wisdom. Those of you who encountered my book Wild Mercy know that that's a special love of mine, is reclaiming the wisdom of the feminine across all the spiritual traditions. And so Wild Heart is really a place where I've really been able to flourish in those two primary areas, women's wisdom and grief as a spiritual path. And in everything I do, I emphasize writing as the primary spiritual practice. So I've talked today about contemplative practice and walking in nature, and all of those things are really important to me. But writing is my daily prayer practice. It's a spiritual practice, which doesn't mean I write spiritual stuff. In fact, I find abstract spiritual writing to be almost unbearable to read. So my writing is very embodied, as you might guess from the way I speak and if you've read my books, and also the way I teach writing is very grounded in ordinary everyday life. It's not about exalted spiritual or political ideals.
So do you have a daily writing practice or sort of daily writing practice?
Sort of.
Sort of.
I've people have asked me that, of course, for many years because I've written a lot of books. Like, how do you
Yes, you're
write
very
all these?
prolific.
I am prolific because I love it. I can't not write. I it's an addiction. It's a healthy, I hope, addiction. Sometimes it's probably not so healthy, but mostly it is. And so I haven't needed a schedule and I don't work well with schedules. I'm a 4 in the Enneagram and we don't like to be told, what to do and when to do it. It's not that we don't like to, it's just it doesn't work very well. And yet I feel like the muse is very reliable so that when I do sit down to write, she comes. She comes through and she's generous with her voice and mingling with mine. It's a co creative dance. And so I haven't really worked well with schedules. Sometimes I've tried, but I'm always on a writing deadline because I almost always have a book contract. And Sarah, and those of you who are published authors know that, at least if you're traditionally published, you have to present a proposal to a publisher. And if they make an offer and you accept it and you make a contract for that book to be written, you have to write it and deliver it by a certain time. And so whether it's a year or 2 or 9 months or whatever it might be, that does wonders for me to schedule my writing time because I I can do the math. I need to do a chapter a week or 2 chapters a week or something like that. I need to leave 2 months for editing. And that helps me kind of almost intuitively structure my days. So I don't write every day the way I do yoga and meditation and walking, but most days.
And if someone listening was interested in starting up some sort of a writing practice in addition to or instead of a contemplative practice, what would you guide her to do, even if she doesn't necessarily consider herself a writer, she hasn't published books?
Yeah.
What kind of practice, like what would that look like?
Right. Well, in the sense that I feel like everyone is a mystic, in that it is our birthright to have a direct experience of the sacred, I feel everybody is a writer with a juicy, important story to tell. Even if that story is just, what it was like to curl up in the back seat of your grandpa's car and fall asleep on a road trip. That might seem like it didn't mean anything, but it means everything. So, you're welcome to go to my website, mirabaistarr.com. Lots of resources for writing as a spiritual practice there, including a self-paced course called Embodied Writing. I do also a lot of online writing workshops and 2 in-person writing workshops, one in Mexico and one in New Mexico. And there are, I'm sure, lots of other places, but maybe the other places emphasize writing, maybe more the psychological dimensions of writing, or writing as a way to just kind of get something out, like get it out of you and then feel better and walk away. But this is writing as a spiritual practice and also an art. They are braided together in my teaching, and the art has everything to do with embodied language.
And what do you feel like is the most kind of surprising or life-changing thing that has stemmed from your mystical path?
Hmm. That my life has become more and more ordinary and more imbued with awe and wonder as a result. That for so many years I was a wannabe monastic, that I always felt kind of trapped in my domestic life and felt like all of these worldly concerns were impediments to my direct experience of God. And that really, if I had it my way, I would just wear white robes and sit in prayer and meditation all day and maybe sing sacred songs, and that would be about it. Eat really simple food, sleep very little. And over the years, I've embraced my sensuality and my desires as not like, okay, I will tolerate this aspect of myself, my ample curves and my love of chocolate and sex and warm baths and streaming TV shows. Like rather than see those as almost necessary evils that I can accept in small doses, I can see everything in my life from meditation retreats to changing a diaper as being of equal value and equally sacred openings to a greater field of aliveness and holiness.
And for those listening, you mentioned just some daily practices to help orient in ordinary mysticism, contemplative practice, embodied writing practice, and that mindset and presence can weave into one's day. Are there any other things that you would recommend to kind of weave this orientation into one's daily life?
I think a lot of it has to do with kindness toward yourself and really fostering a, a gentle, loving voice that lives inside you. That helps so much in opening the field of the sacred. Because so much of our spiritual lives, whether we grew up in a churchy church or, a Buddhist ish monastery, a lot of the messaging around our spiritual lives has been about doing it right and being pure and being perfect and worthy of an encounter with the divine, making yourself worthy. And so that we have big work and big play available to us in dismantling that voice and replacing it with a voice of loving kindness that is seductive, that beckons us, that says, come this way, and you will find wonder, you will find beauty, you will find relief and rest. I purposely personify the absolute, knowing that the absolute is beyond all definition and all gender. But with my sacred imagination, I call her her. And for me, the sacred has taken the form of the divine feminine. And she is generous and abundant and sometimes very quiet, creates a space of stillness and refuge, sometimes is wild and sings loud. It depends on me and what I need. And so I feel like that has given me a vast space of welcome in my spiritual life to conceive of the sacred as the divine feminine. And I take refuge in her and I take cues from her and I let her speak through my typing fingers and my mouth when given the chance. Like now, I never know what she's going to say. But she's probably said enough for today, huh?
Mirabai, what is your current growing edge?
Sorry, that sounds like a question on your list. I'm not sure if I can relate to it. What is my growing? I mean, I feel like I've kind of covered it. What is my growing edge?
Something that you're really leaning into right now, or
Politics. The
oh,
current political situation is breaking my heart. It's making me feel like the world itself is broken and I need to single-handedly charge forth and fix it because that's so much, the conditioning for so many of us. And the world does need repair. That's why in Judaism there's this beautiful teaching of tikkun olam. Tikkun is mending, and olam is world. And it said that human beings were created to repair the broken world, and we each have our own part to play in that mending. And so, yes, the world is tattered and torn right now, and at a rapid rate is coming undone in ways that some of us could never have imagined possible. Like, really? They got away with that? What? And then the next morning, another one. So yes, it is broken. And yes, it is incumbent upon each of us to do our part to heal and soothe and mend. But we can't do it alone. We can only do it in community. And sometimes that requires taking a moment to pause and look around and listen and see where we can best use our mystical prophetic gifts. And sometimes it takes a minute to find what they are, and we discover it often by finding what they're not. Like, oops, nope, that wasn't mine. Economics, no, that's not my thing. But singing, as a form of resistance and protest, yes, that's mine. So we have to be humble and open sometimes to really, and to dismantle our preconceived ideas of what it means to participate in our democracy, in our society, in our communities.
And where can listeners learn more about you? And do you have anything coming up that you want to let us know about?
So my website, mirabaistarr.com, is a great place to start. Or you could just Google me and you'll find it. And that also links to Wild Heart, the community that I mentioned, and Holy Lament only opens 3 times a year because we try to keep it as a sealed, safe container for the people who enter, the grieving people who enter. But it is about to open again in April. So I think we're offering a free 4-day, 1 hour a day online workshop. That's not even really what it is because it's just an hour a day, called Unraveling the Myths of Grief. And that's something that we offer as a gift to people at least 3 times a year. If you're feeling like you've detected the fragrance of the sacred in the fire of your heartbreak, and you want to sort of explore that, that's a great place to do it. If you want to join the community, April is the next opening.
Beautiful. And we'll put those links in the show notes for everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for this beautiful book, for all your beautiful books, and for this deep wisdom of the feminine that you just bring so powerfully and beautifully into the world.
Thank you, Sarah, and to you too. Thank you for all the ways that you support women and soften our hearts and open the way for new ideas and empowerment through being exactly who we are.